That's exactly the dilemma confronting the United States today as Russian warships and nuclear submarines suddenly appear in the Caribbean waters, practically on America's doorstep. The mainstream media tells us it's a show of force. Washington frames it as aggression. But I want us to take a step back and ask, what does this really mean? When Russian warships sail into the Caribbean, the world pays attention. For many Americans, the image of a Russian frigate or submarine cruising just off the coast of Cuba or Venezuela evokes an uneasy sense of déjà vu. It brings back memories of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and those tense moments when the superpowers pushed each other to the brink. But here we are again, watching Moscow extend its naval power into a region long considered the United States' own backyard. The immediate question is, what message is Russia sending, and why now? Let's start with the most obvious hook: proximity. When Russian naval vessels appear only a few hundred miles from the U.S. mainland, they cut through layers of diplomatic abstraction and force themselves into the American imagination. It is one thing to hear about Russian maneuvers in the Arctic or the Black Sea, but when the same military presence emerges just outside Miami's latitude, the issue becomes visceral. This proximity is not accidental, it is calculated. Russia knows that operating in the Caribbean sends a psychological message, one that resonates far beyond the actual military capacity of the ships involved. Another crucial layer is symbolism. The Caribbean has always been more than a cluster of islands. It has been a geopolitical chessboard. For centuries, control of these waters meant influence over trade routes, colonial power, and strategic dominance. When Russia positions warships here, it is deliberately inserting itself into a region historically dominated by Washington. This is less about military necessity and more about saying, we, too, can project power into your sphere of influence. It is a performance, a gesture meant to challenge the myth of U.S. invulnerability. The timing matters as well. Russia's naval display comes at a moment of heightened tension with the West over Ukraine, NATO expansion, and global sanctions. By sailing into the Caribbean, Moscow is responding to American and European pressure with a reminder of its own capabilities. It is essentially declaring, you surround us with bases and alliances, we can appear on your doorstep. 2. This tit-for-tat dynamic is not new, but it is increasingly sharp in today's multipolar order. And it raises an uncomfortable question for U.S. as policymakers. Can America still claim exclusive dominance of its hemisphere? Of course, the practical military threat of a handful of Russian vessels is limited. These ships cannot overturn U.S. naval supremacy in the Atlantic. But to dismiss their presence as mere theatrics would miss the point. Power in international politics is not just measured in firepower. It is also measured in perception. The sight of Russian naval ensigns in Caribbean ports or submarines lurking in warm tropical waters is a visual metaphor for a shifting balance of power. It is Russia's way of telling the United States that its reach is global, not confined to its own shores. And let us not forget the role of allies. Russia's Caribbean presence is often tied to relationships with countries like Cuba and Venezuela, governments that themselves challenge U.S. influence in the region. By docking in Havana or Caracas, Russia is reinforcing those ties and signaling that U.S. sanctions and isolation efforts are not universally effective. Every visit strengthens Moscow's diplomatic hand while reminding Washington that the Western Hemisphere is not closed off to outside influence. For the American public, this development stirs anxieties that echo across generations. The hook is clear. If Russian warships can sit this close, what else might they do? Media coverage amplifies this fear, framing the situation as a direct challenge to national security. Yet at the same time, It forces Americans to confront a contradiction the United States has long deployed its own forces around the world, often right on Russia's borders. When Moscow does the same, the narrative flips, exposing the double standard at the heart of global military politics. Ultimately, Russian warships in the Caribbean are less about military dominance and more about psychological and geopolitical leverage. They are floating reminders that America's once unchallenged sphere of influence is now contested, that global power is shifting, and that the assumptions of the past no longer guarantee security in the present. When those gray hulks slice through Caribbean waters, they carry not just sailors and missiles, but also a message. The era of unilateral U.S. control is over, and the world is watching. History has a way of circling back, and nothing demonstrates that better than the echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis in today's standoff between Russia and the United States. The image of Russian warships appearing in the Caribbean immediately pulls us back into 1962, a year when the world quite literally held its breath. For 13 days in October of that year, the planet teetered on the brink of nuclear war. American families were building fallout shelters in their backyards. Schoolchildren were crouching under desks during duck and cover drills, and every television broadcast carried the heavy tone of looming catastrophe. Now, more than 60 years later, the sight of Russian vessels once again entering these waters awakens those old fears, even if the circumstances are different. The hook is clear whenever a foreign power challenges American dominance so close to home, the ghosts of 1962 rise. The Cuban Missile Crisis was never just about missiles. It was about spheres of influence, about the right of one superpower to place weapons near the other's borders, and about how far each side would go to test the resolve of the other. The U.S. had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, pointing them directly at the Soviet Union. In response, the Soviets attempted to place their own missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. The logic was simple: if you can threaten us at close range, we can do the same to you. This mirrored symmetry of threat and counter. Threat became the essence of the Cold War, and its traces are visible today in Russia's decision to sail warships into the Caribbean. What makes the parallel so striking is not just the geographical similarity, but the psychological impact. In 1962, Americans suddenly realized that the safety of their homeland was not guaranteed. For decades, wars had been fought overseas, with oceans serving as protective barriers. The Cuban Missile Crisis shattered that illusion. Today, the presence of Russian warships so close to U.S. shores touches the same nerve. It forces Americans to once again confront vulnerability, to imagine what it means when an adversary has the capability to operate within striking distance. That visceral unease is precisely why Russia chooses the Caribbean as its stage. The echoes go even deeper. In 1962, the confrontation ended not with a military clash, but with negotiation. A secret deal in which the U.S. removed its missiles from Turkey while the Soviets pulled theirs out of Cuba. That resolution revealed something important. Behind the posturing and the brinkmanship, both powers recognized the need for compromise. Today, when Russia projects force into the Caribbean, it is not only reviving memories of crisis, but also pointing toward the same demand for reciprocal recognition. If the United States insists on pushing NATO to Russia's borders, Moscow will respond in kind by approaching America's sphere of influence. The logic is relentless, the symmetry unavoidable. This historical echo also reminds us of how public narratives are shaped. In 1962, President Kennedy was celebrated for his toughness in forcing the Soviets to back down, while the quiet U.S. concession of removing missiles from Turkey was largely hidden from public view. That selective storytelling framed America as the victor, shielding its population from the reality of compromise. Fast forward to today, and we see similar patterns. The media emphasizes Russian aggression while downplaying America's own military expansions. The hook here is that the past does not simply repeat itself. It teaches us how the same power dynamics are rebranded for each generation. There is another layer worth drawing out. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked the closest the world has come to nuclear war, and its shadow has haunted international relations ever since. Every maneuver involving great powers near each other's borders carries a residue of that fear. When Russian warships sail into the Caribbean today, they may not be carrying nuclear missiles, but they are carrying the memory of nuclear brinkmanship. That memory alone is powerful enough to rattle markets, shape foreign policy, and stir public anxiety. It is a reminder that history is never buried. It is always waiting to be awakened by the right trigger. Ultimately, the echoes of 1962 show us that these moments are not isolated incidents, but recurring dramas in a long geopolitical theater. Each act may look different, but the script is familiar: great powers pushing boundaries, signaling strength, and risking escalation in the process. The presence of Russian warships in the Caribbean is not just a modern provocation. It is a deliberate revival of one of the most dramatic episodes of the Cold War, designed to remind Washington that it, too, can be made to feel the unease it so often inflicts on others. And for the American public, the hook remains as sharp as ever when history repeats in the Caribbean. The question is whether we have learned enough from the past to avoid reliving its most dangerous consequences. Russia's decision to send warships into the Caribbean is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a direct message to Washington, a geopolitical reminder that if the United States insists on pushing up against Russia's borders, Moscow has the means and the will to return the favor. This is not simply about naval exercises or routine deployments. It is about demonstrating parity in a global chess game where proximity equals pressure. The hook is sharp. The very logic that Washington has used to justify its actions abroad is now being mirrored back at it, and the reflection is deeply unsettling. For decades, the U.S. has maintained a forward posture around the globe, stationing troops and weapons near rivals as a way to project dominance and deter challenges. NATO's eastward expansion, which has steadily inched closer to Russia's borders, is perhaps the clearest example. From Moscow's perspective, the presence of American missiles and bases in Poland, Romania, and other Eastern European states is not defensive, but provocative. When Russian officials argue that they are being encircled, they are pointing to a reality that Americans often prefer to ignore. What Russia is now doing in the Caribbean is a carefully constructed response, a demonstration of the principle that if you can live near our borders, we can live near yours. This tit for tat logic has a long history in international politics, but it is especially potent here because it strikes at the heart of America's self-image. For generations, the United States has viewed the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence, a concept rooted in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. That doctrine asserted that no foreign power would be permitted to meddle in the Americas without facing U.S. retaliation. Yet the irony is that Washington has never applied the same restraint to itself, consistently involving itself in the affairs of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Now, by parking warships in the Caribbean, Russia is holding up a mirror, forcing the U.S. to see how it feels when the same principle is applied against it. The symbolism is amplified by geography. Russian ships in the Caribbean are not just in international waters. They are close enough to remind Americans of their own vulnerability. That nearness translates into political pressure. Suddenly, theoretical debates about NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe feel much less abstract. The message is simple. If Washington insists on projecting power into Russia's neighborhood, Moscow can and will reciprocate. And that reciprocity, even if limited in scale, has the power to change the tone of global diplomacy. What makes this maneuver especially effective is that it challenges the double standards embedded in the U.S. narrative. American officials often present NATO's presence near Russia as a purely defensive measure, but they frame Russia's presence in the Caribbean as naked aggression. For the global audience, this discrepancy is glaring. It highlights the fact that the U.S. expects to act with impunity while condemning others for the same behavior. Russia's move, therefore, is not only a challenge to Washington, but also a strategic play for international legitimacy. By exposing this imbalance, Moscow strengthens its claim that the world is moving toward a multipolar system where no single power can dominate unchallenged. The timing adds another layer. The United States is already embroiled in multiple crises: domestic economic inequality, political polarization, and costly foreign commitments. Inserting warships into the Caribbean at such a moment allows Russia to magnify those pressures. It forces U.S. leaders to respond, to allocate resources and attention to yet another front. This stretching of American bandwidth is part of the strategy. Remind Washington that it cannot control every theater simultaneously, and that its attempts to do so come with costs. For the American public, the hook is visceral. Seeing Russian ships in the Caribbean sparks immediate concern. If they are here, what could they do next? This anxiety feeds the broader narrative that U.S. security is no longer guaranteed by oceans and distance. That unease is precisely the effect Russia wants to generate, not because it plans to launch attacks from the Caribbean, but because it wants to shift the psychological balance of power. In geopolitics, perception often matters as much as reality, and the perception of vulnerability can alter decision-making at the highest levels. By sailing into the Caribbean, Russia is sending a calculated message that global power is no longer a one-way street, and Washington will have to live with the same pressures it has long imposed on others. The hook is sharp, unavoidable, and deeply political. If the United States insists on surrounding Russia, then Russia will remind America what it feels like to be surrounded in turn. The emergence of Russian warships in the Caribbean is not just a military maneuver or a symbolic poke at Washington. It is a signal of a deeper transformation in the global order. For much of the 20th century, the world was defined by bipolarity, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in rivalry. With the Soviet collapse in 1991, that bipolar system gave way to a unipolar moment where the United States stood unrivaled as the world's dominant power. But today, that unipolarity is eroding, and the appearance of Russian naval power in America's backyard is a vivid reminder that the age of multipolarity has arrived. The hook is immediate. The U.S. is no longer the sole director of global affairs, and the stage is now crowded with new actors determined to claim their share of influence. Multipolarity means more than just competition. It means multiple centers of power shaping world events simultaneously. Russia's naval presence in the Caribbean is a statement that it is still a major actor on that stage, refusing to be marginalized by Western sanctions or diplomatic isolation. By deploying ships so close to the United States, Russia is reminding the world that it cannot be written off as a regional player. Instead, it is asserting itself as part of a larger constellation of powers, including China, India, and others, that together challenge Washington's dominance. The message is not subtle. The unipolar world order is gone, and the U.S. must now contend with rivals who are willing to contest its influence, even in regions it once considered untouchable. This shift is visible in the alliances and partnerships that underpin these maneuvers. Russia does not act in isolation. It coordinates with China on energy, trade, and security initiatives while cultivating ties with nations like Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran. These relationships amplify Russia's ability to project power and signal that American-led isolation campaigns have limits. Every time a Russian warship docks in Havana or Caracas, it is more than a port call. It is a reminder that U.S. sanctions have not broken these countries and that alternative centers of power exist outside Washington's orbit. The hook here is that multipolarity thrives on networks, and those networks are growing stronger in defiance of U.S. pressure. The economic dimension of multipolarity is equally significant. The United States once dominated global trade and finance to the point where no rival could realistically challenge its economic leverage. Today, however, the rise of alternative systems, BRICS financial institutions, new trade corridors, and currency swaps that bypass the dollar have started to chip away at that dominance. When Russia places its navy in the Caribbean, it is not only making a military point, but also reinforcing an economic reality. American power is increasingly constrained while global alternatives are becoming more viable. This is the broader battlefield of multipolarity, where ships in the water symbolize more than just missiles. They symbolize a shifting balance of global authority. For Washington, this new reality is deeply uncomfortable. The U.S. foreign policy establishment has long been accustomed to dictating terms, setting the rules and enforcing compliance. Multipolarity strips away that comfort. It forces U.S. leaders to negotiate, to compromise, and to recognize that their power is no longer absolute. The presence of Russian warships in the Caribbean embodies this reality in dramatic forms. It is a direct challenge to the assumption that the Western Hemisphere remains America's uncontested sphere of influence. The psychological shock lies not in the firepower of those ships, but in the symbolism. They represent the erosion of a system in which America's word was final. For the American public, the hook is subtler but no less powerful. For decades, the narrative of U.S. dominance has provided a sense of security and stability. The idea that American power is unparalleled has been a cornerstone of national identity. But multipolarity disrupts that narrative. The sight of Russian warships so close to U.S. shores is a tangible reminder that the world no longer bends to Washington's will and that rivals now possess the ability to unsettle the American heartland. This realization forces a reckoning. Are Americans prepared to live in a world where power is dispersed, contested, and no longer guaranteed by a single hegemon? The truth is that multipolarity is not coming. It has already arrived. Russia's naval maneuvers in the Caribbean are part of a larger pattern of challenges to U.S. supremacy. China expands its influence through trade and infrastructure projects. India asserts itself as a technological and diplomatic power, and regional players from Turkey to Brazil demand a stronger voice in global affairs. The hook, then, is that these ships are not isolated vessels, but symbols of an entire era changing course. The United States now faces not one rival, but many, and the balance of power will be determined not by dominance alone, but by negotiation, adaptability, and recognition of a new global reality. When American leaders speak about Russian warships appearing in the Caribbean, they call it aggression, provocation, even a threat to national security. Yet, what is almost never acknowledged in the same breath is the staggering global reach of the United States' own military. With more than 800 military bases scattered across the globe, spanning from Europe to Asia, Africa to Latin America, The U.S. maintains a presence so extensive that no other country even comes close. Russia, by contrast, has fewer than 24 bases outside its borders, and most of them are located in former Soviet states. The hook is impossible to ignore. The United States routinely does what it condemns others for doing, and the double standard is laid bare every time Washington protests about Russian maneuvers near its territory. Consider the narrative that dominates American politics. When NATO expands eastward, placing troops and missile systems near Russia's borders, the story is that this is defensive, a stabilizing move meant to protect allies. But when Russia deploys ships into the Caribbean, an action far less permanent than a land base, it is framed as aggressive, destabilizing, and unacceptable. The symmetry is striking, yet rarely acknowledged in mainstream debate. What is defensive? When done by Washington is provocative. When done by Moscow. This inconsistency is not just rhetorical, it shapes public perception and legitimizes policies that otherwise might be viewed as hypocritical. The hook here is that narratives, not just weapons, are the real battleground in geopolitics. The sheer scale of U.S. military presence makes the double standard even sharper. Think about it. American aircraft carriers patrol nearly every ocean. U.S. fighter jets are stationed in countries thousands of miles away, and American missiles sit within striking distance of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. To the nations on the receiving end of this presence, these are not neutral acts. They are constant reminders of American power and surveillance. Yet the American public is told that this is simply maintaining security. If Russia or China were to establish even a fraction of the same reach, the reaction in Washington would be apocalyptic. The hook is that what the U.S. calls security, others inevitably experience as encirclement. The double standard is reinforced by historical memory. The Monroe Doctrine declared nearly 2 centuries ago that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to foreign influence, effectively reserving the Americas as Washington's exclusive sphere. That doctrine has been invoked repeatedly to justify U.S. interventions in Latin America, from covert coups to military occupations. Yet the U.S. refuses to recognize that other powers might claim their own spheres of influence near their borders. When Moscow protests NATO's proximity, Washington dismisses it as paranoia. But when Russian ships sail into the Caribbean, the U.S. invokes the very logic it denies to others, the sanctity of its neighborhood. The hook is that the rules of the game change depending on who is playing, and Washington has long assumed it gets to be the referee. What makes this double standard dangerous is not just its hypocrisy, but its effect on international trust. Other nations see through the contradictions, and each time the U.S. condemns Russia for behavior it routinely engages in, American credibility erodes. Allies may still cooperate, but the moral authority of U.S. leadership weakens. This erosion of legitimacy is one reason why the multipolar world is gaining momentums. Countries are increasingly unwilling to accept Washington's rules when those rules are applied selectively. In this sense, Russia's warships in the Caribbean are not only a challenge to U.S. power, but also an exposure of U.S. inconsistency. For ordinary Americans, the hook lies in the disconnect between what they are told and what is real. Citizens hear that Russian ships nearby are a dire threat, but they are rarely told that American ships sit just as close to Russia, day after day. They are encouraged to fear encroachment without recognizing how often their own government encroaches on others. This selective narrative fosters anxiety while insulating U.S. actions from scrutiny. And in doing so, it perpetuates a cycle where Americans are shocked by challenges that, from a global perspective, are simply reciprocations. In the end, the presence of Russian warships in the Caribbean forces a confrontation with this double standard. It compels us to ask, why should Washington have the right to surround its rivals, but no rival should ever approach America's borders? The answer, unspoken but clear, is that the U.S. believes in its own exceptionalism. But as rivals gain strength and assert their own influence, that exceptionalism becomes harder to sustain. The hook that lingers is simple yet profound. When America calls others aggressive for doing a fraction of what it does daily, the world sees the hypocrisy even if Americans themselves do not. When Russian warships sail into the Caribbean, the immediate headlines scream about security threats, foreign aggression, and military posturing. But beneath the surface of that coverage lies another story, one that speaks less about Russia's intentions and more about America's internal political dynamics. Fear of the foreign enemy has long been a powerful instrument in U.S. politics, used not only to rally the public but also to divert attention from crises at home. The hook here is sharp. When Americans are asked to look outward in fear, they often stop looking inward at the inequalities and failures shaping their daily lives. The United States today is grappling with a host of domestic challenges. Rising inequality, stagnant wages for millions, soaring healthcare costs, unaffordable housing, and political paralysis that leaves even modest reforms stalled in Washington. These are not abstract problems, they are lived realities for ordinary citizens. Yet in moments of foreign confrontation, those urgent issues are pushed off the front page. A Russian submarine near Cuba or a frigate docking in Venezuela suddenly dominates the news cycle, giving political leaders an opportunity to appear strong, resolute, and decisive. The hook is obvious. Nothing unites a divided public faster than the image of a looming external threat. This tactic is not new. Throughout history, leaders have invoked foreign dangers as a way to consolidate support and suppress dissent. During the Cold War, the specter of communism was used to justify everything from massive military budgets to the curtailing of civil liberties. After 9/11, the fear of terrorism shaped American politics for decades, expanding surveillance, fueling wars, and creating a culture of permanent emergency. Today, Russia's naval presence near U.S. shores fits into the same pattern. A ready-made distraction from economic and political failures that are far more damaging to the daily lives of Americans than a few foreign ships ever could be. The media plays a crucial role in amplifying this distraction. Images of Russian sailors saluting from Caribbean waters make for compelling television. The narrative is dramatic, urgent, and easy to package. By contrast, stories about rising medical bankruptcies or the quiet devastation of homelessness lack the same spectacle. The result is a public conversation dominated by fear of the external other rather than focus on internal reform. The hook here is that fear travels faster than facts, and political leaders know how to exploit that imbalance. At the same time, military confrontations abroad also serve as a justification for staggering levels of defense spending. The United States already spends more on its military than the next several countries combined, yet each new threat becomes the rationale for more. Russian warships in the Caribbean, though not a practical danger to American dominance, are invoked as proof that funding must continue to flow into the Pentagon. Even as public schools close, healthcare systems buckle, and infrastructure crumbles. The foreign enemy becomes a convenient shield against questions about priorities. Why is there always money for aircraft carriers, but never enough for affordable housing? Why can the U.S. patrol the world's oceans, but not guarantee clean water in every city? The hook is uncomfortable but clear. The louder the alarm about foreign threats, the easier it is to avoid accountability at home. For politicians, the strategy is effective because it appeals to emotion. Fear is visceral. It overrides rational debate. When citizens are told that Russian ships are near their borders, the reaction is immediate and primal: protect us. That urgency drowns out the slower, more difficult conversations about health care reform, wage stagnation, or climate change. And in that drowned out silence, the status quo is preserved. Leaders who struggle to deliver improvements domestically find in foreign threats a convenient stage on which they can act strong without solving the hard problems. For the American people, however, the consequences are real. Each time foreign fears are amplified, attention drifts further away from the issues that most directly affect families and communities. While warships make headlines, medical bills pile up. While politicians warn about Russian aggression, wages stagnate against rising costs. While television screens show naval exercises, cities struggle with homelessness and crime. The hook that lingers is this: the greatest threats to American well-being are not anchored in Caribbean waters. They are anchored in policies and systems that leaders prefer to ignore. In the end, Russian warships in the Caribbean may rattle nerves, but their deeper function lies in how they are used within U.S. politics. They become tools, convenient distractions from domestic crises that demand attention but rarely receive it. The spectacle of foreign confrontation provides cover for leaders who would rather posture abroad than deliver justice at home. And so the cycle continues, with Americans asked again and again to fear what lies beyond their shores, while the challenges within them remain unresolved. The hook is piercing. Foreign warships may come and go, but the domestic battles left unaddressed will shape the nation's future far more profoundly.